What if I told you that a legal battle over Trump-era import duties is pretty much the only reason your Walmart groceries are on sale today? And, well, at the exact same time, construction companies are literally using artificial plasma to melt granite mountains in Italy just to protect internet servers.
It sounds completely disjointed, but it's actually all happening right now.
It is. Today is Thursday, August 20, 2026, and the levers of the global economy are behaving in ways that, frankly, completely defy standard financial textbooks. We're looking past the dry analyst jargon today to expose the incredibly weird money mechanisms that are quietly steering corporate investments, reshaping your wallet, and in some cases, physically altering the environment.
Yeah, the traditional expectation is that financial mechanics operate with predictable physics. A central bank raises interest rates, borrowing slows down, and the charts map out this comforting, rational curve. But the developments hitting the market right now, they completely shatter that illusion.
Because we're seeing completely opposite pressures, right?
Exactly. We are tracking several distinct, massive pressures moving in entirely different directions. So capital is flowing at unprecedented scales into physical infrastructure and AI hardware. But then the consumer applications and the government policies trying to manage all this are colliding, and it's creating some fascinating and highly chaotic side effects.
Speaking of consumer collisions, let's talk about the grocery aisle.
Yeah.
If you have noticed your grocery bill fluctuating recently, or maybe certain items suddenly flashing red rollback signs, there is a very bizarre financial loop happening right in front of us. Walmart just reported its slowest sales growth in 6 years for the quarter between May and July.
And their internal data on that is super granular. It shows that lower income households are pulling back hard. And the specific trigger point, according to their chief financial officer, John David Rainey, is the exact moment fuel prices cross $4 a gallon.
That $4 mark is like a psychological wall. The price moves back in June made the behavior immediate. People just abandoned discretionary items, like toys or electronics, and they focus entirely on absolute caloric essentials. But Walmart is fighting back with an 11,000 item price cut.
Right. They're rolling out 11,000 price cuts across their stores to prevent shoppers from abandoning their carts entirely. But the mechanism they are using is what makes this so unusual. They aren't funding these discounts through operational efficiency. They're funding them using an expected $3 billion in tariff refunds.
Wait, $3 billion? From where?
These are rebates stemming from import duties the retailer paid during the previous Trump administration, which federal courts recently ruled were unlawful. Target also received roughly $1 billion from this exact same legal reversal.
So we essentially have a massive corporate swear jar. The government collected these disputed tariffs, held onto the cash for years, and now that the courts have intervened, those billions are accidentally funding a nationwide grocery discount. What I struggle to understand, though, is how the math works for the retailer long term. Because Walmart is hoping to lock some of these rollbacks in for 2027, but they are simultaneously facing huge margin pressures from building out new, highly automated warehouses.
And that's a structural problem. This $3 billion injection feels like a temporary sugar high for their profit margins. It's not a sustainable business strategy. The distinction between a one-off fiscal windfall and a structural economic shift is the core issue here. The tariff refund is simply a historical accounting adjustment.
Because once that $3 billion is spent subsidizing cheaper food, the money's gone.
It's gone. Once it's spent to keep transaction volumes up, the fundamental cost of operating those new automated warehouses remains. Shoppers might get accustomed to the cheaper groceries, but the underlying margin pressure hasn't disappeared at all. The executives are pointing to growth in their advertising and membership businesses to bridge the gap, but the core retail environment is operating on borrowed time.
Which makes the contrast with the automotive sector so fascinating, because we are seeing the exact same policy concept, tariffs, fundamentally altering industrial strategy in a permanent way. Hyundai is aggressively accelerating plans to invest $26 billion in the U.S. by 2028.
And they are very explicit about why. Their CEO, Jose Munoz, spoke at the reveal of their new Genesis SUV, and he pointed directly to avoiding 15% tariffs on South Korean imports. That's the primary driver for boosting production at their massive plant in Georgia.
The scale of that Georgia plant is wild. They are aiming to produce up to 800,000 units annually there, which would make it the largest vehicle assembly operation by capacity in the entire country. Their stated goal is to jump from producing roughly 40% of their U.S. vehicles domestically to 80% by the end of the decade.
So we are watching one economic lever produce two radically different timelines. For Walmart, past tariffs provide a brief, retroactive cash cushion. It helps them survive a temporary consumer pullback. But for Hyundai, the threat of current and future tariffs forces the creation of permanent physical capital. I mean, they are entirely reshaping regional supply chains and hiring over 8,500 people for the Georgia megasite alone.
The geographic center of gravity for their manufacturing is moving permanently, and that fundamentally alters the industrial tax base and the labor market of the American South.
It does. And the sheer scale of that physical hardware being built in Georgia, it actually mirrors the astronomical sums currently being poured into the physical foundations of the tech economy right now.
Oh, absolutely. You look at Micron, they're committing $250 billion by 2035 to build fabrication plants in places like Boise, Idaho, and Clay, New York. I mean, $250 billion.
And even with all that capital and billions in government CHIPS Act funding, their CEO, Sanjay Mehrotra, noted that the supply for specialized high-bandwidth memory chips will be severely constrained through 2027 and 2028. It simply takes a massive amount of physical time, concrete, and labor to build the clean rooms that stack these delicate memory wafers.
It's this massive physical bottleneck for digital infrastructure.
Yeah.
But the glaring disconnect here is between the hundreds of billions spent on that foundational infrastructure and the incredibly messy reality of how this technology functions in the wild.
It's a mess. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Gartner recently released data showing zero return on investment for the initial $30 to $40 billion corporations spent on generative AI.
Yeah.
The application layer is just a chaotic frontier.
Because no one knows how to actually use it productively yet. A recent broad survey showed that 84% of workers using AI in their daily jobs are entirely self-taught. They're operating without official company policies or guardrails. Which brings us to my new favorite analyst term, work slop.
Work slop. It perfectly captures it. It's AI-generated content that looks highly articulate at a glance, but lacks any real substance or factual grounding.
The concrete examples of this are incredibly frustrating. There's this communication CEO from Michigan who lost $10,000 because a contractor submitted a marketing campaign that was clearly generated by a bot. She had to rewrite every single piece of content manually.
And it's changing the day-to-day culture of offices. A copywriter in Chicago noted her job has basically been reduced to arguing with colleagues who blindly trust the output of chatbots over human editorial judgment. We even have experiments showing that workers who admit to using AI are perceived as lazier and less likely to be assigned critical projects.
Which is wild when you think about the fact that there are companies just spending billions to build the infrastructure for these very tools. So why is it making work worse?
Well, the underlying issue driving the frustration is a behavioral phenomenon called social offloading. It manifests when humans use bots as a substitute for direct communication and coordination. So when a project manager uses an AI agent to aggressively filter their inbox, or leaders use bots to summarize meetings instead of having, actual developmental conversations with their teams, the technology acts as a middleman that actively degrades human connection.
It's outsourcing the friction of being a person, but that friction is where the actual work happens.
Exactly. And Oxford University data shows that this kind of social offloading drops team coordination by 12% and increases the desire to quit by nearly 30%. There is a profound psychological cost when everything is mediated through an algorithm.
And it's not just in the workplace. Imagine you are just trying to sell an old fleece jacket online, and you run directly into that algorithmic wall. Vinted is a pre-loved clothing app with 17 million users in the UK.
Their algorithmic moderation system is currently permanently banning human users for completely normal behavior.
Right, there was a single mom who dropped the price of used sandals to roughly $2.70 just to clear out her closet. The bot lacked any contextual human judgment, flagged the sudden markdown as counterfeit fraud, and permanently deleted her account.
And there is no human customer service number to call. The algorithm is the absolute judge and jury.
So the global economy is frantically competing for scarce memory chips, digging up the earth to build multi-billion-dollar fabrication plants, all so a broken algorithm can ban a top professional seller over a pair of cheap sandals. And honestly, speaking of human curation, if you want actual human editorial judgment instead of gatekeeping bots, you can find Financial Candy, Brain Candy, and classic audiobooks over at clarineratio.com.
The irony of all this AI investment is that while we're pouring capital into digital systems that frequently alienate users, the physical world where those data centers actually live is becoming exponentially harder and more expensive to build in.
We are hitting a wall of what you called earlier brutal materiality.
Yes. Housing economists point out that property prices have wildly outpaced everyday goods. In the UK, millennials born in the mid-90s now have only a 25% chance of homeownership. And a massive driver of this is the sheer cost of basic construction materials.
Like the actual physical stuff you need to build a house.
Right, the cost of timber, steel, plasterboard, and concrete. It surged initially from pandemic shortages, and then it compounded dramatically due to energy costs soaring from the war in Ukraine and subsequent geopolitical shocks in the Middle East.
And those same geopolitical energy shocks are tearing through industrial supply chains. The British food giant Bernard Matthews just announced the closure of a major factory in Derby by the end of 2026. They explicitly cited significant financial losses tied directly to the costs of energy, supply chain disruption, and the broader geopolitical environment.
The surface world is becoming highly unpredictable and remarkably expensive to operate within. And that physical reality is forcing companies into some incredibly extreme engineering solutions.
This is the part that sounds like a sci-fi movie. A firm called EarthGrid recently demonstrated tunnel boring machines using plasma torches that burn at 27,000 degrees Celsius.
To put that temperature into perspective, they are not mechanically drilling or grinding the rock. The plasma torch sublimates the material. It turns solid granite instantly into a gas.
That is horrifying and amazing. But why do we need to vaporize granite?
Because engineering firms are using this extreme technology to hide power pipelines and fiber optic cables deep underground, we are seeing rapidly rising demand to put data centers and substations beneath the surface, heavily driven by the realization that above-ground facilities are incredibly vulnerable to modern threats like drone attacks or extreme weather events.
So I have to ask, is the surface world getting so expensive and geopolitically risky to operate on that it actually makes financial sense to use artificial sun plasma to bury our servers inside a mountain?
Well, it's not science fiction. It's currently happening in Italy. The Trentino Datamine facility is placing servers 100 meters deep inside the Dolomite Mountains. They are utilizing 90 million cubic meters of solid rock for natural cooling and physical protection against drone strikes.
Okay, but the cost of that has to be astronomical.
It is, but it absolutely makes financial sense when you factor in the new economic reality of risk premiums. We are re-entering that era of brutal materiality. For decades, the global economy prioritized efficiency and cost cutting, assuming the physical environment was basically safe and stable. Now, companies are paying a massive premium for basic security.
So it's cheaper to vaporize rock than to risk an exposed asset getting destroyed.
Exactly. Even subsea internet cables are now being buried up to 3 meters deep into the ocean floor just to protect them from ship anchors. Tunneling is exceptionally expensive. I mean, the London Power Tunnels project cost roughly $1.3 billion for just 18 miles. But the financial devastation of an exposed asset failing is now considered far higher.
And you see a less extreme but equally impactful version of this flight to safety in the U.S. commercial real estate market. Capital isn't moving underground there, but it is fleeing the expensive, highly regulated coastal hubs.
Yes, the National Association of Realtors data shows demand surging in secondary markets like St. George, Utah, and Spartanburg, South Carolina.
St. George actually has the most significant office employment growth in the nation right now. The math of building and operating a business simply no longer works in the primary markets, so the capital flows to where the physical space, regulatory environment, and operational costs are lower.
The unifying thread across the plasma tunnels, the mountain data centers, and the migration to Spartanburg is this huge recalculation of physical vulnerability. The global economy heavily discounts assets that are exposed, whether exposed to supply chain shocks, regulatory costs, or physical threats. And it heavily rewards locations and technologies that offer isolation and predictability.
But regardless of whether you are boring plasma tunnels in Europe, or building auto plants in Georgia, or funding a government, someone ultimately has to finance this massive wave of spending, and the math on that is getting very scary.
It is. The United States national debt recently surpassed $40 trillion, with the monthly deficit hitting $432 billion in July alone.
$432 billion in 1 month. The deficit to GDP ratio is sitting near 6%, which is roughly triple its average since the end of World War II. The sheer gravity of that debt is starting to severely warp the bond market.
The scale of the borrowing is creating acute friction between the Treasury Department and the broader market. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is attempting what analysts are calling a guerrilla tactic to manage this pressure.
A guerrilla tactic in the bond market. How does that work?
Well, he announced a plan to at least double long-dated debt buybacks, pushing them to over $4 billion per operation. The explicit goal is to manually inject liquidity and push down the yields on long-term government bonds, while offsetting that by issuing shorter maturity debt.
I'm going to stop you there because my head is spinning and I want to make sure I understand the mechanics here. It sounds like the Treasury are trying to bail out the ocean with a bucket. How does $4 billion in buybacks actually move a $40 trillion market?
That's the million-dollar, or rather the trillion-dollar question. And when you look at the rollout of this plan, analysts heavily criticized it because Besant announced it abruptly, just 2 weeks after their regular quarterly refunding plans.
Which completely breaks the Treasury's long-held strategy of making highly predictable, telegraphed announcements, right? The bond market hates surprises.
It hates surprises, and that breakdown in predictable communication is precisely why the markets are highly skeptical. They view Besant's move as a very weak, almost panicked intervention.
So why doesn't the $4 billion move the needle?
To understand why it struggles to have an impact, we have to look at the shifting buyer base for U.S. government debt. Central banks are shrinking their balance sheets, so they are stepping away from buying our debt. The buyers replacing them are heavily leveraged hedge funds running relative value strategies.
Okay, for someone who doesn't spend their day staring at a Bloomberg terminal, what exactly is a relative value strategy and why does it matter to our national debt?
Fair question. A relative value strategy in this context involves hedge funds making massive, highly leveraged bets on tiny price differences between various types of government bonds. Because they are taking on so much leverage and absorbing record amounts of debt issuance, they demand much higher yields. This is what we call term premiums. They need that to justify the risk of locking up their money.
So the Treasury is trying to introduce what people are calling the Besant put.
Right. It's a signal to these hedge funds that the government will intervene to prevent yields from spiraling too high and impose losses on anyone betting against U.S. debt.
But introducing that tactical guerrilla operation risks a direct, incredibly messy clash with Federal Reserve Chair Kevin Warsh. Warsh has openly stated he wants to update the 1951 Treasury-Fed Accord and hand more balance sheet authority back to the Treasury because he views the Fed's bond holdings as fiscal policy in disguise.
And that's where the friction really sparks, because Warsh's current preference is for the Fed to shift its own holdings towards short-term debt.
But if the Fed's task force decides to dump long-term bonds while the Treasury is desperately trying to buy them, aren't they just fighting each other with our money? The central bank's actions would have the exact opposite effect, pushing those long-term yields right back up.
They are absolutely pulling the levers in opposite directions. And it highlights the severe tension between fiscal policy and monetary independence. The Treasury is frantically trying to keep borrowing cheap to fund a historic deficit, while the Federal Reserve is mandated to manage the money supply and keep inflation anchored.
Warsh is essentially testing the limits of Fed independence by signaling that the central bank will not act as a bottomless sponge for government debt.
Yes. And if the Treasury and the Fed are not perfectly coordinated on how they manage the Fed's $6.7 trillion balance sheet, the bond market will exploit that gap. Investors will demand even higher risk premiums, driving the cost of financing all the infrastructure we discussed earlier up even further.
Pulling all of these threads together, today's economy clearly does not fit into one neat box. We are watching massive retailers survive on historical tariff refunds, tech companies wrestling with the destructive psychological consequences of their own AI algorithms, and governments attempting to muscle a $40 trillion bond market with highly criticized $4 billion bucket scoops.
The underlying story here is about adaptation in real time. The systems the global economy relied on for the past 30 years are being re-engineered while they are still running.
Like trying to change the tires on a car while you're driving down the highway.
Exactly. The financial mechanics are shifting from an era of frictionless globalization and cheap capital to an era defined by brutal materiality, massive risk premiums, and severe supply constraints.
The real scarce commodity right now isn't specialized memory chips or cheap housing materials. It is predictability and trust.
That is the ultimate economic bottleneck across every story today. When a consumer no longer trusts a selling platform because an unfeeling algorithm might randomly delete their livelihood over a pair of used sandals, or a worker cannot trust that a colleague's email isn't just an AI hallucination, Massive friction enters the system.
And at the macroeconomic level, if global investors lose trust in a government's ability to coordinate its bond strategy between the Treasury and the central bank, the cost of financing the entire global economy skyrockets.
When systems rely this heavily on automated AI or unprecedented government intervention, maintaining human confidence is the only thing keeping the machine running.
But that raises a fascinating new question. If human trust and predictability are the new premium commodities, how long until we see companies charging us an extra human verification fee just for the guarantee of interacting with a real person instead of an algorithm? The ultimate luxury in the near future might simply be a human being answering the phone. We will leave you to mull that over until next time.